I think people will stroll in as required. So let's kick this off. This is the April 9th edition of the SIG Release biweekly meeting. This is a meeting that will be recorded and on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say, and please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. We're going to let Tim Pepper kick it off with some notes regarding the RPM and Deb package management support policies.
So there's a link in the minutes there to a message I sent out to SIG Cluster Lifecycle and SIG Release Google groups. I would definitely welcome some feedback or discussion there, but the gist is that we had a packaging problem, and it was around how we declared our dependencies in the packages. And it's, as best we understand at this point, it appears to be a conflict between how we lay out the packages in our repositories. So we're constantly just adding or appending to the directories in which we publish the files, and the way we articulate in the specific, the metadata around the packages that we require a certain version of something. And then on the client side, both how apt or yum consume those. So there's like 3 different variables in play, and it's kind of a surprising bug. We can change some things in our spec files to make it easier for people to upgrade, but this, in the bigger picture, it raises a question of what should we be doing? And there's some semi-competing proposals, and those then get into things that are a bigger discussion around what should we support. So the main place this came up was for people who are wanting to run old versions of things and versions that we know to be bad. So that raised a question of like, should we do that? So I've tried to outline that in the conversation there and reference some issues, but I'm basically just looking for feedback because I have something that I could propose for a change, but there's maybe 2 or 3 other things that people might want, and it definitely changes how we support stuff.
So open mic there, if anyone has opinions.
Maybe I made a question then if people don't have anything coming to mind immediately. Like, is this something that people think should be a KEP, like to propose a specific support plan for our packages and gather support around that, or competing KEPs?
Wait, yes, I think it should be a KEP because this is going to affect quite a few people.
I think there should be competing KEPs from the people who oppose or propose a different perspective. They should speak in terms of KEP if there is a KEP in.
I think if we've got competing parties at this point, that yes, eventually a KEP is the end state that we want, but if there are competing ideas, we should throw up a doc. We should throw up a doc, let people battle it out in the doc, come to some consensus, come to some loose consensus at least, and then like work together to make the KEP.
So I'm realizing I hadn't put all of the links I'd intended to in the notes. So I'll put a few there, and I guess if anybody wants to asynchronously discuss after, and I could start drafting something maybe for a proto document ahead of a KEP.
All right, just adding some notes to the doc. All right, so Tim to work on that. Next up, Tim again, regarding the patch release management team.
I guess this is kind of semi-related in a way, but as we produce things that are out there for people to consume. One of the sets of things that SIG Release produces is our patch release branch content. So after 1.14.0 gets released, 1.14.1 comes out, and so on and so forth from there. Today, those come out at a somewhat arbitrary cadence. We say maybe a couple weeks after the .0 release, we publish the .1 release. And then after .1, it tends to elongate to 3 to 4 weeks. But that's sort of it. It's a open-ended schedule, and perhaps if there's a CVE, that would trigger something to come sooner. But I'm curious if people think that we should be doing something a little more reliable or predictable there.
So I see that we have some people who have been involved in the LTS chatter on the call. I'm particularly curious about their opinions there.
Yeah, I think there should be a frequency around which patch releases are made, but then you have security patches, etc. That should be made on the discretion of the patch release manager.
Yeah, and I sort of agree. I think we're at the mercy of CVs when they come up, and that's kind of a separate case to be handled by the product security committee as well as the patch release management team. From the perspective of figuring out when to do patches, I think part of the thing that we run into is having the notion of a team in the first place, right? Classically, this has been a member of the release team that a member of the release team that essentially works on the release team and then owns that patch release schedule from after the release is cut up to the 9 months following that, right? So that's not really a sustainable model, and that's part of the reason that we're building out a team for this, so that we can kind of share responsibilities and everyone has everyone on the team at least has the same ability to respond to product security committee requests for new patches, and can develop a schedule that's actually sustainable for a set of people as opposed to one person. So I think that this is something that's coming. I think if we can come to some loose consensus on what that schedule should be in the near term, that would be valuable. I think I think saying 3 to 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks per patch release is fair. If there are contrary opinions, I'm curious about them.
Hello.
Hey, we can hear you.
Right. So I've been kind of shadowing the patch release team for some time now, and this discussion, I think I've had with Tim Pepe before. What I would suggest is if we could see what other major projects do in terms of patch releases. I'm quite familiar with Microsoft's idea of I think it's Patch Tuesday, is it Patch Thursday? I don't know which one it is, where they basically release all patches for all their products. So if you have things like, say, for example, I see you have patch requests for cherry picks for, say, K8s, K8 1.114, 113, 112. You could kind of like bundle them all together and release it on, say, at that same frequency of which we could choose. But that kind of idea would make it easy for somebody like me who has to operate a Kubernetes cluster to kind of put a schedule. So if I have, say, for example, disparate clusters running or something of that sort. So I think all I'm trying to say is I kind of support the frequent release model, and also it because of specifically the schedule, the ability to schedule and plan upgrades and updates. Of course, given the fact that if there is a security patch, it would be given precedence or something of that sort. But yeah, basically that's what I'm trying to say.
Similar kind of came up last month ahead of the security-related fixes that were released all together. And as those were being triaged by the security team, and I see this as being a pattern going forward that could repeat, that not everything is a critical CVE. And critical CVE surely is going to lead to a more rapid rollout, but there might be a variety of things that are fairly low criticality. And then the security team specifically asked in last month, well, when's the next release? If it's coming soonish, we could just wait and announce these couple minor issues after the release when the fixes are out. And to me, that kind of feels like that Microsoft approach, where not everything is critical and needs to go out the door, but you could sort of batch and bin things, and that feels like it makes life easier for somebody who's needing to evaluate the criticality and then work on deploying multiple things together.
Yeah, and I think for the Microsoft Patch Tuesday, like it is a combination of not just security checks, but it's overarching updates to their software, right? So I think it's been a while since I've been in a Microsoft centric sysadmin world, but that's what I remember them to be. If they were higher criticality, they were released as needed. So I think that we're not far away from that, and I think that we, the way we release right now the patches, we have a general schedule, and we tend to land patches like soon after for multiple versions. For us to get in lockstep with multiple versions, we do need to expound on like what it means to be a patch release management team. And I think some of that work is already in progress with Tim, but it is like firming up that roster and making sure that we have coverage, because a lot of the times the cadence of the patches are wholly dependent on like, can that person be available to crank the knob to turn out the patch, right?
I've been with a few open source projects that have gone from irregular patch releases to regularly scheduled patch releases, and it has never been a disadvantage to having stuff regularly scheduled. In the projects that have done this, everybody likes it. The users like having the regularity. The people who are volunteering on the patch team like having the regularity. The only thing I would actually question for this is whether we actually want to do it less often. I mean, what's been proposed is every 3 or 4 weeks. Do we need to do it that frequently? Does the patch release team want to do it that frequently?
I mean, I think that I think that there are some maybe diminishing returns for doing it at a longer cadence given our current release cadence, right? Given we're releasing quarterly, if we're waiting longer than a month to cut a patch release, then it might even make more sense to figure out how to move to the next version, right? If our cadence changes, I think that we should assess that, but I kind of defer to the patch release management team, because I don't do the day-to-day of cranking that wheel. I think that a monthly schedule is reasonable, though.
Yep, I think there should also be some kind of provision for patch manager to be able to release something out of cadence, so that it's easier to release something. Like last time when we had a Kubernetes release, we had a Go bug and we weren't sure when the Go next release is going to be, and we created our own containers, and we weren't sure when the next container is going to be. So predictability helps, but also releasing something so that the projects that depend on us on that bug will also get some reprieve.
Right.
Tim has something to share.
So I just shared a little spreadsheet that I had made just after going and looking at prior releases, cadences, and we're Historically, I mean, there's not a lot of historical data there, I guess, but historically we've drifted towards monthly anyway.
Yeah, I think when you look at some to the example of Go, we did not act, there's no easy place where you can go and see when the next version of Go is released. So there is no defined policy, but there is an pattern. So we also have a pattern of about monthly releases, but I think it's good to have a defined policy that says we will do our best to release every month. And if there is anything urgent, the patch release team has the liberty to take a call.
The other thing I haven't gone and crunched, but anecdotally, a good portion of the patches across the 3 supported branches are effectively the same. They're cherry picks off the same change in master. And I need to put in the counts of patches per release, but I feel like we're fairly consistently 1 to 2 dozen patches. So if those are mostly the same, then doing that once a month where it overlaps across the 3, there's not a huge burden on the patch release team to coordinate that more closely.
All right. So, I mean, like and Tim and I have talked a little bit offline about like just, I guess, bolstering the patch release management team. If there are no concerns on your part, then we should turn this into policy. Yes, no, maybe so. Of course, there will be like a mailing list update and all that stuff, and hold for comments. But I think overall it's a good idea. It's something that we're kind of doing already, and I think we have the infrastructure in place to be able to do it consistently. So we should just say that we're going to do it moving forward.
Okay, so that was going to be my question. Like, just do the standard lazy consensus sort of. We've already basically nearly been doing monthly, so we're going to focus on delivering monthly lazy consensus. Any objections?
Exactly. Yeah, and send that out to. I would say send that out to the patch release management mailing list, the SIG release mailing list to start the conversation, and then KDev.
I'll loop in the security folks as well.
Yes. Thank you, Tim.
Yep.
All right, so over to Jim Angel regarding the surveys. Jim, if you're talking, you're on mute right now, by the way.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm driving right now, so pardon the noise, but I'm looking to iron out the dates of the survey. So when does it get released? When do we allow leads to review it? And then what time do we close it? And in that sense, just curious, there was some kind of chatter there on Slack, and just curious what everyone's overall opinion is on the current schedule.
So I think right now did we release last week, and we're making decisions by Friday? Was that? I think that's what we landed on, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the lazy consensus or what we've done in the past. And there's really no formal structure, I think, on the 114 survey is like, this is a good idea, let's try it. Here's what worked, here's what didn't work. And now my goal is to start to iron out some policy there, how we handle this moving forward. So it's not ambiguous. It's, a little bit more clear in that direction there.
Yeah, for sure. So so the idea of, and thank you again, Josh, for having this idea and putting forth the initial questions for the survey. So we released the survey for the first time in 113, and that came out as the release cycle, like after the release cycle had started. right? So that was the first problem, right? You know, the people who were selected did not have enough time to one, review all of the applications, quote unquote applications or questionnaires, and reach out to the appropriate people. Also, I think that we had a I won't call it an issue. I think, you know, I think it was a nicety, like that we can garner that kind of interest. But we had over 200 responses to the 113 survey, right? And as the release is starting, as the people have assumed these new roles and are learning how to lead in that role, as well as figuring out how to mentor people and who are the people they should be mentoring, I don't necessarily think it's fair for them to have to try to sift through 200 applications, right? So, you know, we were having some chatter on the Slack channel, and I think that it's reasonable for us to expect, it's reasonable for us to land the survey at the same time that we're opening up lead selection for the previous cycle, or for the next cycle rather, right? So that's right around, I mean, we haven't pinned it down to any specific date, but it's usually right around code freeze, and by usually I mean for like maybe the last 3 cycles or so, we've had it around there. So for anyone who's not familiar, prior to having the survey within the 114 and 113 cycles, is essentially I would create a GitHub issue saying like, hey, we're assembling the team. A bunch of people would shout at that issue. I would you know, collate the people that were shouting at the issue and group them into the appropriate categories, or, you know, try to find a spot for them. That, you know, that essentially means it's first come first serve, as opposed to the best person for the job, right? And you know, there are additional factors to consider around you know, availability, you know, time zones, the skill set required, the ability for the lead themselves to be able to practically mentor the amount of shadows that they have coming into that role, right? So there are a lot of quantifiables that are not necessarily quantifiable depending on who the person is, right? So I think that, one, it's reasonable to bring this survey forth during the lead selection process. The question that came up from that, and then close it, let's say 2 weeks after the leads are selected, right? I think that's a reasonable time frame that gives you about maybe a month and a week or something, right? It's for, and you know, and that's, you know, in terms of us like just shouting out the message like, hey, the survey is open. I truly believe that people haven't had enough time this cycle, right? I'm sure we have like I'm sure we have well qualified candidates, but the opportunity to like it's a very small window, 2 weeks. So I think that extending that a little bit around the code free cycle is one improvement that we can do, and two, for us to do that, we have to be able to target someone who's going to own this process, which means that you know, this new role that we've introduced of a emeritus advisor, the role that Josh is holding for the 114 cycle, has to be selected, or at least this is my opinion, that it has to be selected along with the release lead and and possibly the lead shadows, right? So I think we lock the lead in place, we lock the advisor in place for that cycle, and then the advisor goes forward and does the selection.
Yeah, I'm not sure that emeritus advisor needs to be a permanent position. I was planning to revisit that as we get towards the end of this particular release cycle. There was a special case why we want to actually do it for this specific cycle, but it may be hey, I'm in 115 to tweak the process, and when I'm done tweaking the process, this role doesn't need to exist.
Okay, so I mean, and that's completely fine. I think that in that case, we need some, if we're going to decide that the role doesn't need to exist, like you said, we can do that later in the cycle. If we decide that that is true, then we need some contingency of who would handle the surveys, right? This is something that I explicitly don't want on the release team lead. I think that, you know, they have more than enough to wrap their hands around as they're getting ready to be a lead. So maybe one of the lead shadows is a potential, or someone who is in someone who is in an outreachy role, right? So
Yeah.
comms
Okay.
are. Mhm.
Well, so that's, I guess that's an argument to actually have the position just to kickstart the shadow process, because we don't necessarily have shadows selected for the release lead position right away. In that case, I would say that this position, the emeritus advisor position, should be something that SIG Release picks, if you follow me, so that we can pick it even when we may still be discussing who's going to be the lead next cycle.
Right. So and I mean, I think this kind of like bleeds into something that we did with the owner's files starting this release, or it merged, I think, yesterday or the day before. So we redefined some of the owner files and actually took the time to decide what, like, the concept of a subproject owner or subproject owners for the release team subproject, right? It's not just a team, it actually is a subproject within SIG Release, which means that we should define subproject owners. I think the de facto subproject owner has always been understood to be the release team lead, right? They're the person who ends up as the approver for all of the directories and subdirectories related to the release cycle. They're the one who gets added to all of the relevant groups so that they can give access to people for the relevant things and buttons that you need to hit or turn during the release cycle. But that said, we kind of we were talking privately about putting up the, and it's merged now, so it is law, quote unquote law. The previous the N-4 or so release team leads to seed the subproject owners file. I have volunteered myself as a subproject owner as well for the release team. It's something about the release team HR has always been near and dear to my heart for the last few cycles. So I've volunteered to do that. But I think that we should leave that as a responsibility for the release team subproject owners, right? So that would include the previous release leads for N-4. So right now that is Aaron, Aish, Tim, and Josh. And then as they rotate, they can either decide to stay in or bump out. I don't want this to necessarily be necessarily need to be a rotation. I think that more hands make the work light. So the opportunity to have multiple eyes over that would be good. But I think that that's something that we should feel fine delegating to the subproject owners for a release team. And that also provides some consistency for this subproject across the release cycles, right?
Yeah, no, real quick, going back to the dates, you mentioned 2 weeks after the leads are chosen. Could we maybe clarify on that, just in case leads get chosen, takes a little bit longer or whatever, maybe we should pin it against the release dropping. I don't know, just throwing it out there
so
as far as when we finalize it.
So I would like to think that choosing the leads is easy or should be obvious by the end of the cycle or close to the end of the cycle. By code freeze, I think everyone in their respective roles has a decent idea of the shadows that are contributing, actively contributing, the shadows that are actively interested in taking on the role, and can and then I think it's really on them to make the decision. What has happened classically in the last few cycles is that we've essentially sent a ping to the leads and said, like, hey, this is around the time that you should be considering who your successor is going to be. We want to do selection on X date, or this either SIG release or burn down or release team burn down meeting, right? And it should be a fast follow. You should be able to declare your successor within that meeting. And then from there, we kind of move forward. Obviously with the release team lead selection being the first new lead that gets selected.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I don't disagree at all with any of that. It's more about formalizing a deadline date that you can actually put in a Git repository versus, we selected all of our leads, and now we have this 2-week runway to get all of our shadows in line. You know, just trying to standardize a little bit more, but not disagreeing it's easy to select the lead, more or less trying to finalize the timeline.
Yeah, so if we want to say that, are we saying that we're fine with starting lead selection at code freeze? Right at code freeze? Do we feel like we need buffer time? Is this something that we should take to a release team meeting instead?
It sounds like there's lazy consensus around that working, and being part of a couple of releases that seem to have worked out.
Yeah, Josh, do you have
I'd say yes. You know, we want to. The process will take a little bit because often our best candidates for release lead will be somebody who's involved in the current release, unless they might not be very responsive about committing to do it or not do it. But you know, if we say we'll start in code freeze and hopefully have somebody selected 8 days into code freeze.
Okay. Or should we say by the end of code freeze, or like how? I think we can tweak out the wording in a PR or something. Jim, since you're working on the survey improvements, do you want to kick that off?
Yep, I was planning on it, and I'll take care of it tonight.
Cool, sounds good. Thank you. All right, so next one is TBD changes proposed from the 114 retrospective. Let's see what we got here. I think some of the last,
I threw that on the agenda just because we hadn't quite gotten to the very end of that, and Claire had mentioned it on Monday in the release team meeting. So it turns out she is traveling, but she had said if there was anybody around who wanted to discuss it and there was time in the meeting, that she'd definitely take feedback. But we may not have everybody applicable today.
So let's. I would love to have Claire on that and Aaron to close out that retrospective. So let's hold off on that item. So Josh, the last item on the agenda is from you about needing to update the release role handbooks with volunteering information.
Yeah, I was helping one of our current leads try to recruit shadows. Branch manager does not have enough shadow candidates.
Okay.
And realized that actually the branch manager handbook is a collection of instructions for how to branch stuff, but contains no summary of what the branch manager does, or how much time it takes, or anything like that. And so I decided to go ahead and check how many of the role handbooks that was true of. And it actually turns out if you take, you know, sort of 4 facts as being essential information for somebody to volunteer, that is a summary of what it does, the estimated amount of time it takes, the sort of general timeline, right? Is this a front-loaded or code freeze-loaded role, and any requirements there are. Only 3 of the role handbooks have all 4 of those pieces of information. So I launched a tracker there to try to get all of those into shape. I'll be filing issues against all of the rest of the role handbooks to say, let's please add this additional piece of information so that people can sign up for it. That's it. Just wanted to make everybody aware because some of you will be named on some of those issues.
I'm happy to see that the enhancements one has all the things. Yeah, so this is really great. I think that in general for people writing role handbooks, please be aware that if it's something that that's generally applicable to Kubernetes, it probably belongs somewhere else and linked out from the handbook, right? If you're saying like, here's a process for doing blah, right? That should probably be somewhere else, right? If it's a process that everyone needs to know about, don't kind of hide that information within a handbook. I encourage all of the leads to work on updating your handbooks. Josh will be bugging you, but this is an additional push before he gets started with that stuff. In general, you should be updating your handbooks throughout the cycle, right? And you should also feel free to question everything that's in the handbook, right? This is this is not just law, right? This is an accumulation of knowledge from each of the people who have held your role in the past, right? So it is like your opportunity to make your voice heard, to your responsibility to make sure that that is up to date for the person who's going to be succeeding in your role. And there wasn't a 3, but I think those are important enough. So please, if you are a role lead and working in the cycle, or if you're a shadow who has been following some of the process in the handbooks and it doesn't make sense to you, right? Feel free to suggest improvements, right? This is our project, right? This is our community. Like, we are all responsible to each other to make this better, right? So that's all my my warm fuzzy spiel on that.
Do we have a poster child for here's what great handbooks look like?
So I think there are a few, and the ones that have all the things, I'm not gonna. CI Signal, I think, is probably one of the more phenomenal handbooks. The release lead one is really good. The enhancements one I wrote most of, so I hope it's okay. And those are the ones that also have the check marks on them in Josh's tracking issue. So I would take those as exemplars and try to squeeze yours into the model of those. I think if it's useful, does it make sense for us to have a handbook template, right? This is what your handbook should look like.
Yeah, I don't know if a template would blanket apply, but I know like Josh rattled off like 4 bullet points of an effective, volunteer list. Some of those key points might not be a bad thing just to outline, but yeah, I don't know if you could templatize like, docs versus CI Signal or, any of the other.
Right. No, yeah, it's more of a guideline of like, these are the things that you definitely need to have in your template, as opposed in your handbook, as opposed to trying to homogenize a template for everyone.
By the way, I'm highly amused that one of the handbooks that was missing all 4 of those pieces of information is in fact the documentation role.
Hey.
I mean, it was that was almost predictable that would be that way.
So this is actually the docs one we had. I did gentle pings across like the last 4 cycles about updating this. So like Jim, this is not on you. This is on a few people. But
no worries. Real quick, make a comment on that. Is Cody and I, one of the shadows for 114, myself, we're working on totally revamping the entire docs handbook. So we got that kind of first draft in there where it's at least 2018 or 2019 updated. But now we're going to drive it home and make it perfect. That's why I was asking about the poster child too. But that's pretty funny about it not having those prereqs in there.
And I think one of the problems is we never really said that they were prereqs, right? I think it was one of the cycles that I was in that we were like, hey, we should do handbooks for this. We should like write what these roles actually do. And it's one of those things that improves over time. I think every time we look at the release team selection qualifications, we look at the shadow selection qualifications, we look at the handbooks, we look at anything that's in the SIG release repo. It's like, hey, we should probably change this, or we could improve this because we did this over X cycle, right? So it's a constant iteration. So it's fine now. It's fine now, but we should lay down. We should lay down a set of requirements for that.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, we are at the end of our set of agenda topics. If there are, I'm going to give it time for open mic, but also ask that I should have done this earlier. Want to start getting into the habit of doing this. Anyone who's on the call who this is their first call, they're just coming to SIG Release, they're trying to figure out what's going on, they want to say hi, please feel free to unmute, introduce yourself, and say what you're looking to get out of SIG Release.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. My name is Abubakar Sadiq, Nai Davis, and you can call me Nai. I've been following the Kubernetes release team since 113. I just wanted to check out what happens in the SIG release meetings and how it differs from the release team meetings on Mondays and the standard release team meetings. And I guess I found out. So,
So, mhm.
that's it.
Well, welcome. So in general, our our focus is on SIG release at large. I think there is often a misconception that SIG release is the release team. The release team is merely one of the sub projects within SIG release. So we have currently we have the release team. We have the licensing and compliance sub project, the patch. So kind of like release engineering, which includes patch release management, is another sub-project. So if you have interests in specific places, you're wondering where to get plugged in, feel free to talk to myself. Tim Pepper, who has been talking on the call, he is also one of the SIG release co-chairs, and Caleb Miles is the other one.
Right. Thank you very much.
For sure. Anybody else?
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, my name is Savita, and I got interested because I started using Kubernetes for a self-serve platform that I was developing. And then I was amazed, and then I wanted to give back to the community, and that's how I got I got involved. So the last KubeCon was my first ever conference and Kubernetes conference ever. So I got to meet people, and I went to this SIG contributor. I think I met Kelsey, someone like that. And also I had this speed networking, and I met Maria there. And she said that if you want to start somewhere, you got to go into SIG release, and that's where she started. And I'm trying to, so I've been attending the meeting for the past 2-3 months, and I'm trying to get my head wrapped around all these things. I think I am getting to understand some of the things now, and still looking to start, still looking for a place where I could start doing things and like help in any way that I could possibly do. Sorry if I was too fast and blabbering.
No, not at all. Welcome to the meetings. Thank you for popping by. Yeah, you've met some great folks on SIG release. I think that whenever I'm doing a meet the contributors or speaking in general to people about Kubernetes, I think that joining the release team or hanging out in SIG release is one of the single best ways to get involved in the project, because honestly, if you're on the release team, you get thrown right into the fire. And like that was my experience for doing it. That I think a lot of people, a lot of coworkers have the same experience. They're like, wow, this was like really exciting to do. It was a lot of work. I wasn't expecting the amount of work that it was, but it's like one of these really valuable experiences where you are essentially forced to interact with the community at large, right? Like forced not in a bad way. Like you have the opportunity to interact with the community at large. I will say that Josh has been working on, Josh and Jim have been working on these improvements to the shadow selection survey. We're hoping that having a functional process there will allow people to more easily contribute to the to the release team, but definitely for SIG release overall, as we start to spin up, so we're working on continuing to solidify the processes around the release team, starting to work on the license and compliance efforts, right? So this is being able to scan and do reporting for all of the dependencies that exist across Kubernetes, right? So that's all of the projects and all of the multiple Kubernetes orgs that exist, right? So that's a few people right now, myself, Steve Winslow from the Linux Foundation, and Nikita. And then the release engineering sub-project is kind of a hodgepodge, right? It's some of the ownership that's across the SIG release repo, the Kubernetes /release repo, which holds again a hodgepodge of our release tools. And then some of the release specific directories in Kubernetes, right? So we're I don't think we have all of the things in place that we want just yet, but that also includes the branch management responsibilities and patch release management team responsibilities that we were talking about earlier. So you know, so I'm hoping very soon. I think that's probably feasible, Tim, that we'll have some process around that and be able to build out you know, more people who are interested in doing like patch release management or something, and having a shadows process there as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
and
for
I
sure.
want to mention one more thing, that this was place that I could get to do other things than my normal work. You know, like if you want to learn about CI, I could possibly do that here, not in my work, because that's not the role that I constantly work on, or like I don't get to see that part of the world. You know.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, what's really great about the release team, again, I'm always rah, rah, rah release team, is that I think each of the roles signify an extension into different parts of the project, right? So like CI signal and test infra, or, you know, one part communication and part SIG testing, right? Being able to, you know, to make sure that the signal is clean, as well as, you know, that the appropriate things are in place to actually release Kubernetes. The enhancements, you know, the enhancements and communications role bleed into SIG PM, right? So, you know, if you have interest there, you can end up on that side. You know, you know, and then there's a variety of roles, like bug triage. You know, bug triage doesn't necessarily have like, you know, it touches a little bit of everything, right? But you know, the opportunity of being in the release team means that you get to reach out to these different groups and get a better idea of what you're actually interested in, right? So I love that part of it, and I love that, you know, everyone is very communicative. They're very friendly. You know, if there's something that you want to do, they'll make sure that you're pointed in the right direction to get it done. So, rah rah rah. All right. Anybody else before we go?
Hello.
Hey.
Can you hear me now?
You are a little low. If you can turn up your volume.
All right. I'll try to. How about now?
Okay, a little better. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to introduce myself here. Say hi to.
Hey, fellow VMware person.
And be contributing to the community for a while, but never have chance to join the SIG Release team call here. And I'm particularly interested to understand how the release process is done upstream. And I'm working on the downstream release, which I'm able to contribute some of my experience here and also learn from upstream.
Yeah, for sure. Welcome to the party. I think that in general, understanding the dynamics of the release team, it'd be great if you occasionally popped into. Again, anyone is welcome to pop into any of these community meetings. The release team meeting in specific will give you an on-the-ground view of what the release team is doing day to day or week to week. So they start off as weekly meetings. Right now they're on Monday, if I'm correct, right, Josh, or anyone on the release team? Currently on Monday. As the cycle, as we kind of like iterate through the cycle, there is like a burn down period, and at the point where we have the burn down period, the meetings start accelerating to like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then like during the last parts of the cycle, it's like Monday through Friday, right? Everyone needs to be in lockstep on what they're working on. So I wouldn't say that you have to go to all of those meetings, but maybe pop in for the initial release team meetings that are happening. We try to do an EU friendly one as well. So we have a US time zone friendly one and an EU time zone friendly ones for the first part of the cycle. And then as burn down starts to kick in, we'll have the Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. So popping into one of those, I think, you know, based on the stuff that you're working on, your interests may lie towards the release engineering subproject as well. And I think that, you know, between you, myself, and Tim, we can talk about the VMware stuff too offline if you want.
Great, thanks.
Yep, sure thing. All right, last call for intros. I think I recognize all of the other faces here. All right, well, with that said, thank you everyone for popping in, hanging out with us. I'm going to give you the last 8 minutes of your meeting time back. Have a great day.